The air in the Cedar County John Deere dealership hung thick with the smell of new rubber, fresh green paint, and the faint, cloying scent of a salesman's ambition. It was the smell of money, the kind of money farmers didn't use to talk about. Frank Miller stood at the parts counter, his knuckles scarred and permanently stained with the ghosts of grease and hydraulic fluid. He felt out of place. The floors were polished linoleum, not the oil-soaked concrete of his own shop. The tractors on display weren't machines, they were monuments. Huge, articulated 8630s with jewels all around, their sound guard cabs looking more like cockpits from a science fiction movie than a place to spend 12 hours turning soil. Frank was 58, but the sun and the wind had carved 65 years of worry into his face. He wore clean but faded overalls over a flannel shirt, his work boots scuffed but solid. He waited patiently, his worn felt cap held in his hands, turning the brim over and over. Behind the main sales desk, Rich Thompson, the dealership manager, was laughing. He was a young man, barely 30, with a soft body that spoke of office chairs and client lunches, not tractor seats and fence mending. His hair was perfectly styled, and his John Deere polo shirt was crisply ironed. He was closing a deal with Gary Peterson. Gary was everything Frank was not. He was 42, barrel-chested and loud, a man who farmed with a checkbook and a telephone. He was signing a stack of papers for a brand-new 40A040, a beast of a machine with a power-shift transmission and every option available. It was his third new tractor in 5 years. "Just sign right here, Gary," Rich said, sliding a pen across the gleaming desk. "And we'll have her delivered by Friday, just in time to get that new 8-row planter hooked up." Gary scrawled his name with a flourish. "Good. Can't be making money sitting still, Rich. Got to keep moving, keep expanding. Get big or get out. That's what I always say." He leaned back, patting his stomach. The bank knows a good investment when they see one. That's when Rich finally noticed Frank, standing at the parts counter. "Frank, sorry to keep you waiting. What can we get for you today? A set of points for that old 730? Maybe some plowshares for that relic you pull?" He winked at Gary, sharing a private joke at Frank's expense. Frank didn't rise to the bait. He just nodded calmly. "Not today, Rich. I'm here to see Mr. Henderson over at the bank office." The dealership had a small satellite office for the Farmers' Trust in a back room, a convenience for financing the very machines Rich was selling. Rich's smile tightened. "Oh, trouble with the note, Frank. Look, if you're a little behind, we can talk. With the price of corn, maybe we can refinance, extend the terms." "No trouble," Frank said, his voice quiet but firm, cutting through the air-conditioned hum of the showroom. "I'm here to pay it off." A silence fell over the desk. Gary Peterson stopped admiring his signature on the loan document and turned around, a look of disbelief on his face. Rich blinked. Pay it off. Frank, your mortgage on the home quarter. That's, what is it, $150,000. He said the number like it was a foreign word. In his world, farmers didn't pay off loans of that size. They refinanced them into bigger loans for bigger equipment. "That's the one," Frank confirmed. Gary let out a short, barking laugh. "Pay it off? With what, Miller? Did that old 40-20 of yours finally start shitting gold bricks?" He gestured around the showroom. "This is how you make money, Frank. You leverage. You use the bank's money to make your own. You can't get ahead turning your own wrenches on 50-year-old junk." Rich chimed in, eager to agree with his best customer. "Gary's right, Frank. No offense. But your operation, it's a museum. A man can't farm 300 acres with a 40-20 and a 2-popper anymore. You're leaving a fortune on the table. We could put you in a new 4440, roll your land debt into the equipment loan. You'd increase your yields, cut your time in the field in half." Frank looked from the slick young dealer to the debt-fueled bravado of his neighbor. He saw the future they were selling, a future built on monthly payments that grew ever larger, a future where the bank owned your land, your tractor, your crop, and your soul. He'd seen his own father nearly lose everything in the 30s, and the lessons of that desperation were etched into his bones. "I like my old junk," Frank said simply. "It's paid for. And when I'm done today, the land will be too." He placed his worn cap back on his head. "Now, if you'll excuse me, Mr. Henderson is expecting me." He walked past them, his boots making a soft, steady sound on the polished floor, leaving the two men standing in a stunned, contemptuous silence beside a brand-new tractor that cost more than Frank's entire farm had just a decade ago. He was a ghost from a bygone era, a man who didn't understand the new rules of the game. Or maybe, just maybe, he understood them all too well. Before we see how Frank Miller scraped together that kind of cash, running an operation everyone else called a scrapyard, I want to ask you something. What was the first piece of farm equipment you, your father, or your grandfather ever paid off completely? Was it a trusty old Farm All M, a Ford 8N that you used for everything? Or maybe an Alice Chalmers WC? I want to hear your stories about what it felt like to hold that title, free and clear. Let me know in the comments below, because that feeling is at the heart of this whole story. The story didn't start in that dealership. It started 8 years earlier, in the spring of 1971, under a grey sky that threatened a cold rain. It started with the sound of grinding metal and a sudden, sickening lurch. Frank was in the middle of the back 80, pulling a 6-bottom John Deere plough with his 4-tout-20. The diesel engine, a workhorse he knew better than he knew his own heartbeat, was humming its steady, powerful rhythm. He'd owned the tractor for 6 years, having bought it used from a retiring farmer up north. It was the newest, most powerful thing on his farm, and the linchpin of his entire operation. Then came the sound, a sharp crack, followed by a high-pitched whine from the transmission that made the hair on his arms stand up. He immediately stomped on the clutch, the pedal going soft, doing nothing. The tractor shuddered to a halt, the engine still running, but the wheels locked. He tried to shift the synchro range lever. It wouldn't budge. It was stuck, solid as a rock, somewhere between gears. Frank shut down the engine, and the sudden silence that fell over the field was deafening. He sat there for a long minute, the smell of turned earth filling the cab. He knew, with the certainty of a man who lives by his machinery, that this was not a simple fix. This was deep. This was inside the cast-iron heart of the machine. He climbed down, his boots sinking into the soft soil. A thin trickle of oil, dark as molasses, was already beginning to seep from the transmission housing, a mechanical wound bleeding onto the land. Any other farmer in the county, especially Gary Peterson, would have done one thing: walk back to the house and call the John Deere dealership. A field service truck would be out in the morning. They'd probably split the tractor right there in the field, haul the rear end back to the shop, and present a bill for $2,000, maybe $3,000 a week later. It was the modern way, the efficient way. Frank walked back to his machine shed. It was an old barn, built by his grandfather, with massive oak beams and a dirt floor packed down hard as concrete. It wasn't fancy, but it was his. He grabbed a heavy log chain and hooked it to the drawbar of his old John Deere 730. The 2-cylinder diesel engine fired to life with its distinctive pop-pop rhythm, sending puffs of blue smoke toward the rafters. It took him the rest of the afternoon, wrestling with the chain and the stubborn, locked-up 40-20, to drag the crippled tractor back to the shed. That night, his wife, Martha, brought him a sandwich and a thermos of coffee out to the shop. The 40-20 was already surrounded by tools. Floodlights cast long, dancing shadows. The air was thick with the smell of penetrating oil. "How bad is it?" she asked, her voice laced with the quiet worry of a farm wife who understood that a broken tractor in springtime meant a broken budget by winter. "It's the transmission," Frank said, not looking up from loosening the bolts on the platform. "Something in the synchro pack let go. I won't know for sure till I get it opened up." "Are you going to call the dealer?" He finally stopped, wiping his greasy hands on a red rag. He looked at her, his eyes tired but resolute. "Martha, they want $700 for a new synchro clutch drum. The labor would be twice that. We don't have that kind of money to spare, not if we're going to make that extra mortgage payment this year." "So what are you going to do?" "I'm going to fix it," he said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "The way my father taught me." For the next 4 days, Frank lived in that shed. He started by draining the 20 gallons of high-guard transmission fluid, saving every drop he could by filtering it through cheesecloth. Using a chain hoist rigged to a heavy ceiling beam, he supported the front of the tractor. He built heavy wooden blocking stands to hold the rear half. Then came the meticulous, dirty work of splitting the machine. He disconnected the hydraulic lines, the wiring, the steering linkage. He unbolted the massive bolts that held the engine and clutch housing to the transmission case. Inch by painstaking inch, using a heavy pry bar and a rolling floor jack, he separated the two halves of the tractor, opening it up like a giant iron clamshell. The neighbors noticed. Gary Peterson drove by slowly one afternoon in his new air-conditioned International Harvester, 1066, the radio in his cab probably playing some country hit. He slowed down just enough to see Frank, covered head to toe in grease, wrestling with the transmission casing. Gary just shook his head and drove on. The next morning at the Co-op Cafe, the talk was all about it. "Saw Frank Miller yesterday," one farmer said over his coffee. "Got his 40-20 split in two in that old barn. Looked like a tractor graveyard." "Heard he's trying to rebuild the transmission himself," another added. "Stubborn old fool. He'll have it in pieces till July. By the time he gets it running, it'll be too late to plant." Gary Peterson, holding court in his usual booth, chimed in. "A man's got to know his limitations. Time is money. While he's playing mechanic, I'll have my corn in the ground and cultivated twice. He's trying to save $1 and losing 1,000. Frank heard the whispers. He heard them when he went into town for parts. He saw the pitying looks. They saw a man falling behind, a relic of a bygone era being crushed by the wheels of progress. They didn't see the quiet determination, the deep satisfaction of understanding a machine down to its last shim and bearing. They didn't understand that every $1 he saved on a mechanic's bill was $1 that went straight to the principal on his land loan. It was a different kind of math, one they had forgotten how to do. Inside the transmission, he found the problem. A snap ring on the high-range clutch pack had failed, allowing the plates to shift and shatter. Metal fragments had circulated through the gears, scoring bearings and chewing up seals. It was a mess. He spent 2 full days just cleaning the parts in a solvent tank, scrubbing every gear, every shaft, until they were spotless. He laid them out on a clean workbench in the exact order they came out, following the dog-eared pages of a John Deere service manual he'd bought at an auction. He found the parts he needed, not from the dealership, but from a tractor salvage yard 3 counties over. He drove his old Ford pickup 2 hours to pick through the wreckage of other dead tractors, finding a used clutch drum that was still in good shape. He bought a new set of bearings and seals from an independent supplier. Total cost, $212. The reassembly was even more meticulous than the teardown. He checked every clearance with a feeler gauge, torqued every bolt to the exact specification in the manual. Finally, the day came to join the two halves back together. It was a delicate, dangerous dance, inching the 1,000-pound engine and front end back to mate perfectly with the transmission. The splined shaft had to align just right. He worked the jacks and the pry bars, sweat dripping from his nose, his muscles screaming in protest. With a final, satisfying thud, it slid together. He worked late into the night, reconnecting everything. By midnight, it was done. He filled the transmission with the filtered oil, bled the hydraulic lines, and checked everything twice. He climbed into the seat, his body aching. He turned the key. The diesel engine roared to life, filling the shed with its beautiful, familiar thunder. He pushed in the clutch, and this time the pedal felt firm and right. He slid the gearshift lever into third. It clicked into place smoothly, without a grind. He let out the clutch, and the big green tractor rolled forward, whole and healed. He hadn't just fixed a machine. He had stared down a $3,000 bill and won. He had lost a week of planting time, but he had kept his money. He had kept his independence. As he drove the 4020 out of the shed and into the pre-dawn light, ready to finish his ploughing, he knew the coffee shop profits were wrong. He wasn't falling behind. He was just taking a different path forward, a slower, harder, but surer path. A path that led not to a bigger tractor, but to a paid-for farm. The years that followed that transmission rebuild were some of the best American agriculture had ever seen. The early and mid-1970s brought a boom that made men dizzy with possibility. Spurred by a massive grain sale to the Soviet Union, commodity prices shot into the stratosphere. Corn that had been $1 a bushel was suddenly selling for $3. Land values doubled, then tripled. The government, eager to see fence-row to fence-row planting, made credit cheap and easy to get. The Secretary of Agriculture himself, Earl Butz, was on the radio telling farmers to get big or get out. For men like Gary Peterson, it was a golden age. He took the government's advice as gospel. He used his rising land equity as collateral to borrow more, buying up 2 neighboring farms from families who were ready to retire and cash in. His operation swelled from 400 acres to over 1,000. With every new parcel of land came a trip to the John Deere dealership. He traded his 1066 for a new International 1466, then traded that for the John Deere 4840. He bought a new 7700 turbo combine, a massive machine that could harvest 8 rows of corn at a time. He built a new grain leg and a set of gleaming silver bins that towered over his farmstead, monuments to his success. Gary was the king of Cedar County. The bank loved him. The implement dealers loved him. The local paper ran a feature story on him, calling him a pioneer of modern agriculture, with a photo of him and his family standing in front of his new combine, smiling broadly. He was living the new American farm dream, a dream financed at 8% interest. Frank Miller watched it all from his 300 acres. The boom was good to him, too. The high prices for his corn and soybeans meant he had more cash in his pocket at the end of the year than ever before. But he didn't follow Gary's path. He didn't buy more land. He didn't buy a new tractor. To the rest of the community, he was a man asleep at the wheel, a fool letting the opportunity of a lifetime pass him by. At the co-op, Gary would clap him on the back, a little too hard. "Frank, you're sitting on a gold mine. That home quarter of yours is worth $3,000 an acre now. You could borrow against it, pick up that old Henderson place next to you. I'd do it myself, but the bank's got me spread a little thin this month." He'd laugh, but it wasn't a friendly laugh. It was the laugh of a man who saw Frank's caution as a personal insult to his own ambition. "I've got all the land I can handle, Gary," Frank would reply quietly. "You're not handling it, you're just getting by. That 40-20 is a joke. You could be working twice the ground in half the time. What are you doing with all that extra money from the high prices anyway? Shoving it in a mattress?" Frank never told him. He never told anyone that every extra dollar was going to one place, the Farmers' Trust Bank. He and Martha lived just as they always had. They didn't buy a new car. Their 10-year-old Ford Galaxy ran just fine. They didn't remodel the kitchen. Martha still canned vegetables from her garden, and Frank still hunted for a portion of their meat. They were ghosts of the Depression, living in an age of explosive prosperity. Instead of buying more, Frank improved what he had. He spent a summer systematically rebuilding the terraces his father had first carved into the rolling hills, preventing the precious topsoil from washing away. He bought a used backhoe at an auction for a few $1,000s and spent an entire fall tiling a 20-acre wet spot on the back of his farm, a piece of ground that had been a soggy mess for generations. He laid the clay tile himself, foot by painstaking foot, transforming the bog into some of his most productive land. Gary Peterson had hired a contractor to do the same thing on his new ground, paying $30,000 for the job. Frank's cost was his own sweat and the price of the tile. He poured a concrete floor in his machine shed. He rebuilt the engine on the 730, not because it had failed, but because he knew it was nearing the end of its hours. He methodically replaced bearings, gaskets, and seals, ensuring the old two-cylinder would run for another 20 years. To his neighbors, it looked like pointless tinkering. They saw a man obsessed with old iron, a man afraid of progress. They didn't see a general fortifying his position, strengthening his defenses, and eliminating his debts while the economic sun was shining. Even Martha sometimes questioned him. "Frank, the Petersons just got back from a vacation in Florida," she said one evening, looking up from the newspaper. "And Mary Peterson has a brand new station wagon." Frank looked at his account book on the kitchen table, at the long column of figures showing the mortgage principal shrinking, payment by payment. "Their wagon has a payment book in the glove box, Martha. Our Ford doesn't. Their vacation was paid for with money they borrowed against next year's crop. We're paying for our land. There's a difference." He held to that belief with a stubbornness that was as solid as the bedrock beneath his fields. He believed that a farmer's only true wealth was in the soil he owned, free and clear. Everything else, the big machines, the new cars, the vacations, was just an illusion, a glittering mirage built on a foundation of debt. As the 1970s drew to a close, the first faint cracks began to appear in that glittering facade. On the nightly news, there were stories of unrest in the Middle East, of gas lines, and an oil embargo. The price of diesel fuel, the lifeblood of every farm, started to climb. The cost of nitrogen fertilizer, made from natural gas, doubled. On the financial pages, a new name began to appear: Paul Volcker, the new chairman of the Federal Reserve. The reports talked about his war on inflation, a word most farmers didn't pay much attention to, and they mentioned interest rates. Prime lending rates, which had hovered comfortably around 7 or 8% for years, were suddenly hitting 10%, then 12, then 15. One evening, Frank was listening to the farm report on the radio while cleaning an injector nozzle for his Fortis 20. The announcer's voice was grim. Grain markets were down sharply today, on news of a U.S. grain embargo against the Soviet Union. In other news, economists are predicting a continued rise in interest rates as the Fed tightens the money supply. Frank stopped his work, holding the delicate nozzle in his grease-stained hand. He looked out the open door of his shop, across his fields, dark and resting under a blanket of stars. A cold wind was starting to blow from the north. The boom times were over. A storm was coming. And he knew with a chilling certainty that most of his neighbors, fat and happy in their new tractor cabs, had no idea they were sailing directly into its path. The first sign of the coming storm was not a thundercloud, but a number on a page. It was the interest rate for Frank's small, seasonal operating loan, the money he borrowed each spring for seed and fertilizer, and paid back in the fall. For a decade, it had been a predictable 7%. In the spring of 1980, the letter from the Farmers' Trust quoted a new rate, 14.5%. Frank stared at the number, his coffee growing cold on the kitchen table. It was more than double. He did the math in his head. It would add thousands to his expenses, eating away at the thin margin he lived on. He tightened his belt, sold a few calves he'd been raising, and paid for his inputs with cash, borrowing nothing. He was one of the few in the county who could. That summer, the sky turned against them. A heat dome settled over the Midwest, and the rain simply stopped. The corn, which should have been shoulder-high by the 4th of July, stood stunted and yellowing in the fields, its leaves rolling up tight like cigars to conserve every drop of moisture. The air grew thick with a fine dust that coated everything in a gritty, brown film. Day after day, the sun beat down from a merciless, metallic sky. For Gary Peterson, the drought was a catastrophe layered on a financial crisis. His 1,000 acres of thirsty corn required a massive amount of fuel to cultivate and, if he chose to, irrigate from the river. The diesel pumps at the co-op now read $1.30 a gallon. His big 4840, with its powerful turbocharged engine, burned through fuel at a prodigious rate. Frank, cultivating his own suffering crop with his lighter, more efficient 4020, used less than half the fuel per acre. He'd watch Gary's rig moving across the horizon, a distant plume of dust and a faint rumble, and he knew that with every hour that engine ran, Gary was sinking deeper into a hole. The real test came in late August. A line of thunderstorms, the first real rain in 2 months, finally promised relief. But the promise came with a price. The storms were violent, spawning straight-line winds that tore across the parched landscape. Frank watched from his porch as the sky turned a sickening shade of green. The wind hit like a physical blow, bending ancient oak trees to the ground. When it was over, he walked his fields. His corn, already weakened, was battered but mostly standing. The next day, the news spread through the county. Gary Peterson's farm had been hit hard. The winds had caught his massive grain bins, the gleaming silver symbols of his empire, and crumpled them like tin cans. 100,000 bushels of last year's corn, which he'd been holding, waiting for prices to rebound from the embargo, were spilled across the ground, exposed to the coming rain and ruin. The insurance, it turned out, didn't cover that kind of damage. Worse yet was the state of his machinery. The storm had toppled a massive cottonwood tree directly onto the cab of his new 7700 combine, shattering the glass and crushing the roof. It sat in his machine shed like a wounded giant. Rich Thompson's dealership sent a service truck out. But the diagnosis was grim. The cab was a total loss, the frame was likely bent, and the delicate electronic controls were a question mark. The repair estimate was $20,000, and it would take weeks to get the parts. Harvest was less than a month away. Frank saw Gary at the co-op a few days later. The usual bravado was gone, replaced by a grey, hollowed-out look in his eyes. He'd lost weight, and his movements were slow, burdened. He was complaining to anyone who would listen. his voice tight with a rising panic. "The bank won't extend me another dime for the repairs," he said, staring into his coffee cup. "They said my debt-to-asset ratio is out of line." Out of line? 2 years ago, they were begging me to borrow more. Now, with corn at $2.50 a bushel and interest at 16%, they treat me like a criminal. "What are you going to do about the combine?" another farmer asked. "I don't know," Gary mumbled. "Might have to hire a custom harvester. But so will everyone else with storm damage. It'll cost a fortune, and they won't get to me till November." Frank listened in silence from his usual spot at the counter. He thought of his own combine, a John Deere 4400 he'd bought used a decade ago. It was small, a 4-row machine, but he knew every belt, every bearing. It sat in his shed, sheltered from the storm, greased and ready. It was paid for. As he walked out into the blinding sunlight, he felt no sense of victory, only a profound and chilling sadness. The new rules of the game, the ones he had refused to play by, were beginning to devour their most ardent believer. He could see the end coming, not just for Gary, but for a whole generation of farmers who had mistaken debt for wealth. The winter of 1981 was a season of dread. The farm crisis, once a whisper on the radio, was now a shout in every farmhouse in Cedar County. The Federal Reserve, in its relentless war on inflation, had pushed the prime interest rate to an unthinkable 21%. Variable rate loans, the kind Gary Peterson and hundreds like him had signed during the good times, were now ticking time bombs. Land values, the foundation upon which the entire pyramid of debt was built, began to collapse. Ground that had been appraised at $3,000 an acre was now struggling to find a buyer at $1,500. Men who had thought they were millionaires on paper woke up to find they were bankrupt. The notices started appearing in the county paper, tucked away in the legal section. Sheriff's sales, foreclosure auctions. Names Frank had known his whole life were listed in cold black type. The Miller Farm, the Jensen Farm, the Anderson Farm. Each one was a story of a family broken, a century of sweat and toil erased by a banker's pen. The atmosphere in town changed. The easy camaraderie at the co-op cafe curdled into suspicion and fear. Farmers who used to share tips and lend each other tools now looked at one another as competitors for survival, potential bidders on a neighbor's land. The laughter was gone, replaced by hushed, desperate conversations about restructuring debt and finding off-farm work. For Frank, it was a time of quiet survival. Because he had no debt, the high interest rates didn't touch him directly. The low commodity prices hurt, but he and Martha simply cut back. They didn't buy anything they didn't absolutely need. Martha's garden became more important than ever. Frank's workshop became the farm's nerve center. He kept his old machines running with skill and salvaged parts, avoiding the dealership's exorbitant prices. While his neighbors were paying hundreds of dollars for a service call to diagnose an electronic sensor, Frank was grinding the valves on his 730 himself, costing him nothing but time and a few gaskets. He was a rock in a raging flood, and for the first time people started to notice. Younger farmers, their faces etched with worry, would stop by his shop, ostensibly to ask about a piece of equipment, but really just to be near someone who seemed to have an answer. He never preached, never said, "I told you so." He just offered quiet advice. "Keep your iron simple," he'd say. "If you can't fix it with a wrench and a manual, you can't afford for it to break." The day of Gary Peterson's reckoning came in the spring of 1982. The Farmers' Trust Bank, the same institution that had financed his rapid expansion, finally called his notes. He was too far gone. The crumpled grain bins, the wrecked combine, and a year of crippling interest payments had been the final blows. His auction was set for a Saturday in early April. The morning was cold and grey, with a raw wind that whipped across the farmyard. It felt like a funeral. Half the county was there, standing in silent, grim-faced groups. They weren't there as vultures, but as witnesses to a shared tragedy. They looked at Gary's equipment, lined up in neat rows, and saw their own vulnerability. The magnificent 4840 tractor, its green paint still glossy, now had a numbered tag hanging from its steering wheel. The 8-row planter, the massive chisel plough, the 7700 combine with its crudely patched roof. It was all there, an entire farming life laid bare for public sale. Rich Thompson, the dealership manager, was there, looking thin and nervous in a coat that was too light for the weather. He was there on behalf of John Deere Credit to make sure the bank got its share from the big-ticket items. He avoided making eye contact with anyone. Gary and his family stood on the porch of their house, watching the proceedings with blank, shattered expressions. Gary looked like an old man, his broad shoulders slumped in defeat. Frank stood near the back of the crowd, his hat pulled down low. He felt a deep ache in his chest. This wasn't a victory. It was a failure of the entire system, a dream that had turned into a nightmare. The auctioneer began his rhythmic, hypnotic chant, his voice cutting through the wind. The smaller items went first: tools, livestock feeders, fuel tanks. The prices were pitiful. Men were buying things they didn't need just to help a neighbor. But there was too much to sell and not enough money in the county to buy it. Then came the big machinery. The 4840, which Gary had paid over $70,000 for, sold for $30,000. The combine brought even less. Frank watched as piece by piece Gary's empire was dismantled and hauled away by strangers. It was a brutal, heartbreaking process. Frank didn't bid. He couldn't bring himself to pick over the bones of his neighbor's dream. The last item to be sold was the land itself. The auctioneer announced the parcels: the home quarter with the house and buildings, 240 acres to the north, and finally, the old Henderson place, the 80 acres that bordered Frank's own farm. The very piece of land Gary had once boasted about, telling Frank he should borrow against his own farm to buy it. When the bidding started for the Henderson 80, a silence fell over the crowd. This was different. This was land. Frank saw Mr. Henderson from the bank step forward, ready to bid on behalf of the bank if the price was too low. The auctioneer started the bidding. "I have an opening bid of $800 an acre. Who will give me $900? Frank felt a nudge. It was Martha standing beside him. She looked at him, her eyes clear and steady. "Frank," she said softly, "that's good land. It's right next to ours." He knew she was right, but the thought of profiting from Gary's ruin felt wrong. He looked over at the porch. He saw Gary's wife, Mary, weeping silently into her hands. He looked at Gary, who was just staring out at the land, his land, as if seeing it for the last time. Then, an idea formed in his mind. It was a different way. The Miller way. He pushed his way through the crowd until he was standing beside Gary on the porch. The auctioneer was still trying to get a bid. Gary didn't even seem to notice him. "Gary," Frank said, his voice low. Gary turned slowly, his eyes vacant. "What do you want, Frank? Come to see the show?" "No," Frank said. "I want to buy the Henderson place, but not from the bank. I want to buy it from you." Gary stared at him, confused. "It's too late. The bank owns it now." "No, they don't," Frank said. "Not until that hammer falls. Withdraw it from the auction. I'll pay you what the bank wants for it. $1,200 an acre. I'll pay you in cash, right now. The money will go to you, not to them. It won't save the farm, but it'll be something for you and Mary to start over with. something the bank can't touch. For a long moment, Gary just stared. His mind, clouded by weeks of stress and despair, struggled to understand. Then, a flicker of light appeared in his eyes. He understood the grace in the offer. Frank wasn't trying to steal his land. He was trying to salvage a piece of his life. He nodded slowly, unable to speak. Frank walked over to the auctioneer and spoke to him quietly. A moment later, the auctioneer held up his hands. "Ladies and gentlemen, the Henderson 80 has been withdrawn from the sale." A murmur went through the crowd. Frank and Gary walked together to the lawyer's table. Frank wrote out a check from his savings account, the money he and Martha had so carefully accumulated over the boom years. It was a huge sum, but it was his money, not the bank's. As he handed the check to Gary, their hands touched. Gary finally looked him in the eye, and Frank saw not the arrogant farmer from the dealership, but a broken, humbled man. "Frank," Gary whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Why?" "Because we're neighbors, Gary," Frank said simply. "That's supposed to mean something." The years that followed the Great Farm Crisis were lean and hard, but they were years of healing. Frank farmed his original 300 acres, plus the new 80, his operation a model of efficiency and resilience. The whispers in the coffee shop had long since died out, replaced by a quiet, profound respect. Men who had once called him an old fool now came to him for advice. They didn't ask about crop yields or horsepower. They asked him how to fix a hydraulic pump, how to read a bank statement, how to tell the difference between a need and a want. He had become the county's unlikely elder statesman, his wisdom forged not in a university, but in a greasy machine shed and a lifetime of careful living. Gary Peterson and his family moved to town. The money from the sale of the Henderson 80 was enough for a down payment on a small house and a fresh start. Gary found a job managing the local co-op grain elevator. It was a humbling change, but he was a good worker, and he knew farming from the ground up. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet competence. He and Frank would see each other when Frank brought his grain in. They didn't talk about the auction. They didn't have to. An understanding passed between them, a bond forged in the crucible of failure and grace. One crisp autumn afternoon, nearly a decade after the auction, Frank was in his shop. He was 75 now, his movements slower, his hands gnarled with arthritis, but his eyes were still sharp. He was watching his grandson, a sturdy boy of 16 named David, who was carefully torquing the head bolts on the engine of the 4020. The old tractor was in the middle of its third engine rebuild, a testament to its durability and the family's dedication to maintaining it. "Easy now," Frank said, his voice a low rumble. "Follow the sequence in the book. Tighten them down evenly, or you'll warp the head." David nodded, concentrating. "Grandpa," he said, not looking up from his work. "I was talking to some of the guys at school. Their dads are all buying new tractors again. Big ones with computers and GPS. They say this old thing is a relic." Frank picked up a clean red rag and wiped a spot of grease from the engine block. He looked at the boy, his own face reflected in the boy's earnest expression. "This tractor doesn't have a payment book, David," he said. "That makes it the most modern piece of equipment in the county. Let me tell you something the salesmen and the bankers will never tell you. You're not just a farmer, you're a caretaker. This land," he gestured out to the open door of the shop, toward the rolling hills glowing in the late afternoon sun. "It isn't really yours. You just get to look after it for a while. Your job is to leave it better than you found it. And you can't do that if you let some man in a suit in a faraway city own it on a piece of paper." He placed a heavy hand on his grandson's shoulder. "This iron, He patted the green fender of the 40-20. It's just a tool to help you do that job. You learn to understand it, to respect it, to fix it with your own 2 hands. You do that, and it'll never let you down. It'll help you hold on to the only thing that really matters. David finished the last bolt and looked up at his grandfather. He saw the deep lines on the old man's face, the quiet strength in his eyes, and he finally understood. He wasn't just learning how to fix a tractor. He was learning how to be free. Later that evening, Frank sat on his porch, a cup of Martha's coffee in his hands. The air was cool and smelled of harvested corn and damp earth. In the distance, he heard the familiar, rhythmic pop, pop, pop of the old 730 diesel. David was out pulling the last wagon of soybeans in from the field. It was a sound of continuity, a sound of life. It was the sound of a legacy, not of acres or dollars, but of wisdom earned and passed on. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, and Frank Miller, the farmer who owned his land, sat in the quiet twilight, at peace.